everyone, welcome to Ethical Point. I am so thrilled you're joining me for this explainer today because we are tackling one of the most dynamic, high-scoring, and frankly fascinating areas of the UPSC Civil Services main examination, specifically General Studies Paper 4. We're going to look at the intersection of international relations and corporate governance. I mean, think about it. The modern world is more interconnected than ever before. You really can't understand the ethics of a sovereign state without also understanding the multinational corporations that operate within it, or the foreign aid that flows across its borders. So let's dive right into this.
Here is our roadmap for today's session. We've got 1. Welcome to Ethical Point. 2. A briefing on global IR theories. 3. A case study on foreign aid ethics. 4. Corporate governance in the state. 5. Key takeaways and summary. And we'll wrap up with 6. A mains masterclass on answer writing. It's a highly structured, syllabus-aligned path designed to give a direct boost to your main scores.
Welcome to Ethical Point.
All right, let's set the stage. I want you to step into a very specific mindset with me for this first topic. Imagine I'm a senior Indian diplomat, and you're the newly minted international relations staff, sitting in your very first briefing. You've read all the textbooks, sure, but now you're actually in the driver's seat of global policy. And the reality you face in that seat, it's all about navigating the ethical friction between global power and corporate responsibility. As future civil servants, you absolutely have to master both international and corporate ethics. Why? Well, because the 21st century isn't just about treaties between governments anymore. It's about non-state actors, massive multinational corporations, and NGOs that wield just as much influence as some sovereign nations. Commerce is literally the modern face of a nation, and your job is to manage the ethical friction it creates. Moving right along to Section 2, Briefing on Global IR Theories. So, to manage that ethical friction, we need some theoretical groundwork. Let's hit pause on the real world for just a second and define the core concepts that dictate how nations actually behave. First up is cosmopolitanism. In layman's terms, this is simply the idea that we are all citizens of a single global community. It's a broad-based approach that promotes the integration of nations. It's driven by globalization, economic integration, and the need for shared markets and people access. Think of global efforts to tackle climate change or achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, right? That is cosmopolitanism in action. But then, on the flip side, we have realism. The harsh truth here is that realism is driven entirely by power and national self-interest. Under this approach, ethics, well, they're strictly secondary. When you see nations like the USA protecting its historic identity by walking out of trade deals, or China establishing naval bases on disputed islands, you are watching realism at work. It's all about maximizing power to influence other nations and secure trade relations.
The core of this realpolitik was perfectly defined by Ludwig von Rockow. He noted, "The law of power governs the world of states, just as the law of gravity governs the physical world." Seriously? Write this down. Memorize it. Using this exact quote in a GS paper IV introduction immediately tells the examiner that you understand the brutal reality of international relations before you even try to apply an ethical framework to it. It's a real game changer for your answers.
So as a diplomat, your daily life is basically a tightrope walk between these two opposing forces. You've got realism, championed by thinkers like E.H. Carr and Hans Morgenthau, which is entirely power-based. And then you have idealism, which focuses on shared interests, peaceful cooperation, and a rule-based international order governed by bodies like the UN and WTO. The absolute crux of Indian foreign policy is finding that ethical middle ground, balancing power maximization with principles like non-interference and peaceful coexistence.
Let's jump into Section 3, Case Study on Foreign Aid Ethics. Theory is great and all, but how does this actually play out when billions of dollars are on the line? Foreign aid is fundamentally overseas development assistance provided by wealthy nations. At face value, it's a noble, highly ethical act. But let's be real, we know better. Aid is often a strategic tool used to gain allies or impose ideologies. So the crucial point is how you, as an administrator, evaluate it. I want you to use this specific 4-step framework. 1. Assess the actual needs of the recipient. 2. Identify the hidden conditions of the donor. 3. Check for any ideological or religious imposition. And 4. Evaluate the impact on regional peace.
Let's apply that framework to a really jarring real-world case. In recent years, the USA imposed restrictions on NGOs receiving USAID funds, basically dictating that they couldn't actively promote or counsel on abortion as a method of family planning. Now look at Mozambique in Africa. They face immense health crises, high rates of HIV, TB, and staggering maternal mortality from unsafe practices. Programs like DREAMS, which are run by local NGOs to provide vital contraception and health advice, were heavily reliant on that exact funding. The donors' domestic religious ideology directly clashed with a local life-or-death health crisis. This whole situation creates immense ethical trade-offs. You have strategic interests battling human welfare, you have pragmatism versus universal ideals. Think about regional stability for a second. When the U.S. provided military funding to Pakistan under the Kerry-Lugar Act to fight terrorism, it simultaneously created severe security tensions for its neighbor, India. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, should wealthy nations enforce their own religious or political conditions, or should foreign aid be solely focused on creating self-reliance for the recipient?
On to Section 4, Corporate Governance and the State.
Let's pivot away from the international stage for a minute and look at the domestic arena, because commerce is the face of the modern state. The global competitiveness of a nation is really defined by its corporate sector. But what happens when companies prioritize power over ethics? Well, we look to corporate governance. The Cadbury Report in 1992 gave us the gold standard layman definition. It is simply the system by which companies are directed and controlled. The goal is still maximizing shareholder value, of course, but doing it in a strictly legal and ethical manner.
Because history shows us pretty clearly that without strict governance, human greed just takes over. Look at this timeline of ethical failures. In 2009, India saw the massive Satyam scandal, where leadership blatantly inflated revenues and profits. Then there's the Sahara Group, failing to refund 20,000 crore rupees to 30 million incredibly vulnerable investors. And it's not just an India problem. In 2017, globally, we saw Kobe Steel in Japan faking data, and Uber facing massive controversies over employee exploitation and data leaks. These aren't just financial oopsies. They are massive ethical betrayals of society.
And those massive failures, that's exactly why regulatory reform wasn't just a good idea, it was completely non-negotiable. The Indian Companies Act of 2013 is basically your ultimate cheat sheet for how India shifted corporate behavior toward ethical responsibility. To tackle fraud, it set up the NCLT for fast-tracking cases. To fix board ethics, it mandated that 1/3 of the board must be independent directors. To stop those sneaky accounting tricks, it required the rotation of auditors. And most importantly for society, it introduced mandatory corporate social responsibility, leading to real-world impacts like Reliance's Project Drishti and various village adoption programs across the country.
This brings us to a super fascinating comparison. In modern governance, sovereign states are primarily driven by national interest and citizen welfare, but non-state actors operate completely differently. NGOs are driven by specific causes, and MNCs are largely driven by profit maximization. So the modern corporate board's ultimate ethical obligation is to ensure that their pursuit of profit doesn't exploit the very society that allows them to exist in the first place.
Section 5. Key takeaways and summary.
All right, let's drop the diplomat roleplay for a second. Speaking directly to you, the aspirant, let's lock in your key takeaways so you can carry them straight into the exam hall. First, international relations is a constant ethical balancing act between realism, which is the pursuit of power, and cosmopolitanism, the need for global integration. Second, never, ever take foreign aid at face value. It frequently masks strategic or ideological goals. Third, corporate governance isn't just bureaucratic red tape, it's the vital framework that aligns profit with stakeholder ethics. And finally, the Companies Act of 2013 is your primary legislative example of how India institutionalized ethical corporate behavior.
And finally, Section 6 means Masterclass on answer writing.
Let's talk about translating all of this theory into high-scoring marks. A major challenge in GS Paper 4 is writing a conclusion that doesn't sound overly naive or brutally cynical. When you get a question on realism versus idealism, use this exact structure for your way forward. Write, we must harmonize the pragmatism of realism with the universal ideals of peaceful coexistence and non-interference. This shows the examiner that you respect the realities of global power dynamics, but you still uphold the constitutional and UN principles expected of a civil servant. Okay, let's put it all together with a mock case study. Imagine you are the civil servant managing that USAID scenario we discussed earlier. A donor's religious conditions threaten your local health program. How do you resolve it? Well, you use the 4-step framework. You acknowledge the donor's perspective, but you prioritize the recipient's vital needs. You seek a middle ground, perhaps separating the specific restricted activities into a differently funded NGO branch, ensuring that the Life-Saving Dreams program continues while maintaining compliance. You always prioritize human welfare over ideological imposition. I want to leave you with this one really provocative final thought, pulling right back to our opening quote.
If the law of power governs states just like gravity, can an ethical framework truly rewrite the laws of international physics, or are we just building better airplanes to fly within that gravity? Ponder that as you prepare your answers. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep studying, stay ethical, and I'll see you next time.